Welcome to Turning, Reflections from the Road Between Buddhism and Christianity. I'm Wendy Haylett. For years I taught Buddhism and explored contemplative life through the lens of the Dharma. But the view gradually changed. The lens turned. It is that turning I plan to explore through the podcast episodes going forward. And I hope you join me on this road and explore the turning with me. Hi, I'm back. I believe it's obvious to my podcast subscribers that sometime during my long hiatus from November 2025 to now, August 2026, the podcast name has changed slightly. Some of you may also subscribe to my Substack, so you might have an idea of what I'm going to talk about in this next phase of Everyday Buddhism, which is now called Turning. For 7 years and 120 plus episodes, this podcast explored Buddhism and contemplative practice. More recently, I have found myself on an unexpected spiritual journey, bringing Buddhism into conversation with Christianity. Rather than start over on a new podcast, I'd like to invite you to join me on the journey as it reveals itself. And thank you ahead of time for walking this turning road with me. The whole turning thing began in December 2024. Though the signs had been there for many years. But I'll begin telling the story in this first Turning episode, starting in early 2025, when I began writing what I thought was my second book about the first practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, Right View. I planned to release the book chapter by chapter as Substack posts, which I did, stopping though at chapter 9, in May 2025. Then, in June, I took what I thought was going to be a short break after recovering from a virus. It was during that writing break that I recognized what I thought was burnout. I wrote, quote, "During the next month or so, I plan to step away from the keyboard and replace it with my journals. I plan to reconnect with nature during our all too brief summer and seek the rest and nourishment my body is asking for. It's a moment to recharge with a quiet, open mind that is focused less on getting it done and more on noticing what I'm thinking, so that when I return, I can bring you renewed reflections." And I did return a few months later. I posted a reflection on Substack in early November, sharing insight into the harvest of my summer rest and reflections. In the post called I Lost My Why, a podcast journey, Everyday Buddhism, and Evolution. I shared that post on this podcast, and that is the last episode I have recorded until this one. I wrote, "I was losing my balance and losing my why by focusing on this one thing, the work of the podcast. I fell victim to a sort of golden handcuffs syndrome. I felt I had to keep doing it, all while I was feeling trapped by the content and focus. And this leads me to a decision to take a break from the podcast," I wrote. "I plan to explore perennial philosophy, consciousness studies, mysticism, and contemplative traditions more broadly. Buddhism will still be a part of the conversation, but not the only lens." So I closed that post with the words I wrote about transformation in chapter 9 of that post-by-post new book called Living Life as It Is, Looking for a Right View in the Fog of Delusion. They were the words of T.S. Eliot from the poem Ash Wednesday. At that time, Eliot's words echoed what I was beginning to understand about the transformation I was experiencing. I shared this. I said, "What I know for now is that things are as they are now," as T.S. Eliot wrote. He wrote in that one chorus, "Because I know that time is always time, and place is always place, and what is actual only for one time, and only for one place. I rejoice that things are as they are." Which is very Buddhist when you think of it, isn't it? Even though it's called Ash Wednesday. And things as they are now for me are much clearer than they were in December 2024, when I was trying to reorient myself after I found myself awakened from the delusion of COVID fear I suffered for years. And as my book recollected, that awakening experience happened in the hospital after I fell and broke my arm in 2 places. But I'll talk about that in an upcoming episode. But here's the thing about transformation. It slowly starts working on you before you even know that something has changed. By February of 2025, when I started writing what I thought was my second book, I knew something was happening to me from the inside out. But I didn't know what it was or why it was. That was what triggered me to write about it, thinking that as I wrote, the fog of delusion would slowly dissipate and I would discover ways to be more firmly anchored in right view. The fog did dissipate, and the transformation continued after I stopped writing during the summer, fall, and winter 25 through 2026. Now, about transformation again. Transformation is a shapeshifter. It shimmered and shifted for me throughout that period. But taking a podcast break stopped the shimmering just long enough that I could start to see that something in my life was missing. I practiced Buddhism for more than 30 years. I have been devoted to Buddhist practice and the incorporation of the Buddhist worldview in my life. That is why I wanted to share through the podcast and the Everyday Buddhism Sangha what I learned, what is helpful, and how others could incorporate Buddhist thought and practice into their lives. But there was something else that I put aside as I devoted my life to Buddhism. And that was a belief in God. I say put aside because I didn't consciously reject a belief in God. Like the Buddha taught in answer to questions about a God and a creator, I felt the question of God was less relevant to my living a good and kind life than what I was learning and practicing in Buddhism. The Buddha didn't answer those questions of God in the negative. It wasn't a rejection. It was a purposeful refocus on expediency using skillful means. And that is what I did too. But my life story around God and religion, although somewhat typical, helped this resurfacing or turning that was happening to me. I won't go too deep into my past experience with God and religion in this episode. But briefly, as a summary, I started as a child being a believer, going to Sunday school, going to church, going to Bible camp, singing in the choir, and getting baptized in our local Disciples of Christ church as a teen. My mother and I were baptized together because my mom was afraid of the water, and it was a full immersion baptism in the church baptismal pool. Being my mother's support while also joining her in her belief through baptism is a wonderful memory. But as my teen years turned into my 20s, our culture of materialism and skepticism subtly influenced me. and my emerging adult life absorbed my thoughts. God and spirituality took a back seat. But moving on into my 30s, in the mid-1980s, I was working in a stressful job in television engineering, and I had recently been diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE. The disease process required more and more rest, so I spent a lot of time reading. I dove deep into the Christian mystics, the desert church fathers and mothers, while studying philosophy. It was a search for something to hold on to. When your world gets turned upside down by a diagnosis of chronic illness with no known cure and lots of scary and painful symptoms, you reach out for something to hang on to. That's when I rediscovered God and belief again, tempered by a philosophical and rational approach. It was a time of desperately reaching out to belief and trust, wanting to believe, while not trusting that belief. Fast forward to where I am now and what I've come to understand about the long transformation I've been experiencing. I am as clear as anyone can be about the present, as Eliot writes in Ash Wednesday. In that poem, he describes his struggle finding and yielding to faith that leads to his eventual conversion to Anglicanism. I see myself in a similar tension, a joyful dance intertwined with the struggle not to surrender. In nature, all transformation is a struggle. The struggle to know you are a separate being from your mother. The struggle to walk. The struggle of becoming an adult and accepting adult responsibilities. The struggle of a butterfly leaving its chrysalis. The struggle of old age. The struggle of illness. The struggle of death and loss. The struggle of spring overcoming winter. It's all hard at times, but a necessary part of life. We hesitate during the transformations of life's seasons. We struggle to surrender to change, knowing we must go forward, though, even if it means our identity is no longer as we thought it was. And in Buddhist teachings, our identity, ourselves, are never who or what we think. We are a process. We are a process of change, steered by other beings, by time, by place, constantly being someone else from moment to moment. At this point in my turning, I have accepted my transformation, my conversion. But there are still times of doubt and questions, which I will share honestly with you as we go on. The word conversion originates from the Latin conversio, which is a turning around, a transformation. And it indicates an internal transformation, a turning toward something inside you, new, something new or something renewed, a new belief, a new truth, a new purpose. The turning is a turning toward and not a rejection of one's past. It is a conscious, positive choice of a new or renewed path rather than a rejection of a prior path, belief, purpose, or community. In our Everyday Sangha, we are studying Henry Shukman's book, Original Love, The Four Inns on the Path of Awakening. And as an FYI, I shared a conversation with Henry, and you'll find that in episode 117 of this podcast. But anyway, in Henry's book, he describes coming home, quote unquote, coming home, his words, to original love as what happens in meditation. It is the awakening experience you have in moments where you feel connected to everyone, everything, and the whole cosmos. But that coming home, in the Zen meditation Shukman describes, is missing something that I've identified as relationship. A feeling, the knowing trust you feel when embraced by a loving father, like in Rembrandt's painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. In part, my turning was prompted by missing that embrace. You know what skeptics and non-believers use as one of their arguments against God and Christianity is that very personal sense of relationship. Many times they imply that the only way someone can embrace Christianity is through a dismissal of rationality or an immature belief in a judgmental old man-in-the-sky God. But far from a dismissal of rationality and an immature belief, the unease hidden in the clouds of my transformation was formed from or as a result of my long decades of meditation and rational investigation into the nature of things, as the Buddha taught. As you have heard me echo many times in this podcast, my teacher, Reverend Koyo Kubose, shared a mission and a mantra with his students. It is, quote, keep going, unquote. And in that spirit, I kept going in meditation, everyday practice, sutra study, and teaching. Those decades of study and practice resulted in an ability to drop the expectations of a self that didn't exist in the way I thought it did. It taught to sit in the questions without expecting answers. And it taught to live in the mystery and gradual revelation of what life is. My transformation, my turning, was a coming home similar to what Henry Shukman describes in his book Original Love. It was, as he described, an awakening experience of connection. It was a feeling of transcendent connection, but centered in a deep love returning to me from a personal relationship, like an embrace, rather than an ideal of impartial compassion. Instead of returning to an empty home that once was filled with laughter, love, and children playing, but it is now silent, I turned and found that I wasn't alone, but in relationship with that original love. It is warm, it is hopeful and strong, and it is inclusive of all my past. So, here I am, transformed and still turning sometimes. I found a faith, a trust in a relationship with God, discovered through meditation and a rational understanding of things as they are. I am happy. But like the shimmering and shifting of my transformation slowly coming into view, the faith I've found shimmers and shifts too. It is like a tender new shoot in like the first green of spring. I invite you to come along and explore with me as I take the first steps into my new transformed reality and alternately look back to see how I got here, all the while sharing some of the struggles I find as I try to protect and nurture that tender, green, budding faith. Thanks for listening to the first episode of my relaunch of this podcast. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode where I take a look back to December 2024 in a moment of grace that I think was the first step on my turning. So until next time, keep going.